Hey, good morning. This is Richard Shu, host of Shu Untied. This morning, I'm really pleased and thrilled to have with me as my guest, Jeff Karp, who's the author of the best-selling book, Life Ignition Tools. He's also the chair at Brigham and Women's Hospital, a professor at Harvard Medical School, an affiliate faculty at MIT and the Broad Institute. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Hey, so great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So, Jeff, why don't you start by telling me a little bit about your book, LIT, Life Ignition Tools. What's it about and why'd you write it?
Absolutely. So about 7 years or so ago, an agent from New York contacted me about some of the research that I was doing, where we turn to nature for inspiration. So I'm a professor at Harvard Medical School. My home institution is the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I run a research lab. And my laboratory is dedicated to the process of medical problem solving. So trying to make academic discoveries and then turn those discoveries into products that can help patients in the shortest period of time. And often we run into all kinds of challenges and hurdles along the way. And so what we do is we'll turn to nature for inspiration. Nature being the best problem solver, hundreds of millions of years of research and development all around us. And so Heather Jackson, this agent from New York, saw a couple articles that were written about my work focused on bio-inspiration. So turning to nature for new ideas and overcoming challenges so we could advance our technologies to patients. And she said, hey, how would you like to write a book about that? And I was immediately intrigued and excited. And I took a few days to think about it because my tendency is to just jump in with an answer. And I've been trying to emotionally regulate and, really think things through. And I realized that there was actually something much more like a burning desire of something I wanted to write about, which is how when I was younger in elementary school, I was really struggling with undiagnosed ADHD and learning differences. And I didn't know it. My parents didn't know it. My teacher certainly didn't know it. And I needed to develop all kinds of tools and strategies to survive. And then eventually I sort of turned those strategies into those that I could use to thrive. And I said to Heather, would you be okay if I focus the book on that, on these tools and strategies that I've been developing throughout my whole life and continue to be developing? And she was interested and excited about it. And so that's how the book LIT began.
Interesting. So it ended up being kind of more of a personal tools as opposed to you're based on your research.
Exactly. Yeah. So the tools in the book come out of my laboratory of life. And I've been using the tools in my laboratory to figure out the highest value questions to ask, to figure out how to really use diversity as a superpower, because we need lots of different ways of thinking about problems and different access to tools and resources and knowledge, and how we can look at failure as an opportunity to be creative and to gain insights that we wouldn't otherwise gain. And so I've been using all these tools that I've been initially sort of using to navigate life in my laboratory to advance medical technologies.
So give me a couple of examples of the tools that you developed to help overcome your ADHD, your undiagnosed ADHD.
Sure. So one of the tools, I'll actually, maybe a place to start is in the third grade. I actually moved out to the country, and we're talking like, I had a sheep farm beside me, buffalo farm across the road. There was a creek that ran across our property. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, there'd be a pack of wolves on the front lawn. So that kind of, out in the country. And one time, I'd be getting off the bus because it was in the country. So I'd get off the bus and I'd feel very frustrated. I was trying to figure things out, trying to assimilate why is everybody else kind of getting things, I'm not getting things. And so, the walk home, as I was sort of walking home, I felt this like solace from nature. There were no iPhones or there was no internet really back then. And as I walked along this driveway, which is actually 1,000 feet long, every single day, I just felt like the rumination and what was sort of in my mind slowly dissipated.
Hmm.
And I started to develop a deep connection with nature. And I really, in a visceral way, felt how, as I walked up that driveway, that I just felt better, and it was so clear to me that there was something about my connection to nature that was so important. And
Hmm.
so one of the tools for me is really intentionally finding ways to get out into nature. And by the way, that could even be just like, for example, we have two dogs. I walk the dogs around the neighborhood, a few times a day. And one of the things I do is I cycle through my senses. So I'll actually try to resensitize my senses by connecting with things in nature. So I'll look at, like, I'll say sight, and I'll look at the texture of the bark on the trees, and I'll look at the tops of the trees and the clouds and the grass, and the textures. And then I'll say hearing, and I'll listen for the sounds of the birds and the rustling of the wind in the leaves. And then I'll say touch, and I'll feel the clothes on my skin, and I'll feel my heel hit the ground. And as I do this, actually a number of things are happening. One is I'm actually connecting more deeply with what I'm focused on.
Hmm.
And over time, I feel like, most things you do once, you might feel something, you might not, but if you commit to it over time, when you start focusing your attention on something, it creates this force, this energy that builds and builds and builds. And so over time, like, I've been able to really deeply connect with nature, and I feel that presence, that solace, every time I go for a walk in my neighborhood. So, I don't need to go out into the woods to feel it. I can feel it kind of right in my backyard. And the other thing that, I mean, so that's like sort of one of the tools is I refer to it as, like, hug nature. And it's really about this relationship with nature and finding ways to connect with it, because, and then the science is very clear. All kinds of reports showing that you can switch from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate comes down, your blood pressure comes down, your breathing rate comes down. There's a general sense of wellness. And by the way, like, some people may think like, oh, I go out into nature, I don't feel anything. Nothing happened, I didn't feel a shift. I think sometimes that's an indication of how far we're attuned to the rhythms of life, like how, how kind of like almost how much work we need to do to kind of get back into that connection with nature. So I feel like that is a sign, actually,
Hmm.
that we need to kind of put more work in. And
Hmm.
so that's one of the tools. Another tool, I actually, as I was walking down this driveway, it happened to me as well, where I saw something and I wasn't sure what it was. And it was kind of hanging from a tree. And I was like, what is that? And I got up close and closer and closer, couldn't figure it out. And next thing I knew, I was totally surprised, because I was like face to face with a bat.
Hmm.
And I'd never seen a bat before. Um, and what was so amazing to me, other than being surprised and excited to see the bat, was that all these thoughts that were in my mind, the rumination, they were all squeezed out, and all I could think about was the bat. Like, I was laser focused on it. And I reflected on it later. Awareness was a really key thing for me, and reflection on my day, and trying to figure out, behaviors of other people. And, I was always analyzing everything. And I was like, wait a moment, this is so interesting, because, I'm pretty extreme ADHD. I can barely, I didn't know I was ADHD actually at the time, but like, I could barely focus on anything. But it was just like, wait a moment, maybe I could intentionally focus. Maybe I could squeeze the other thoughts out of my brain, just like the bat did.
Hmm.
And I kind of thought of this as pinching my brain.
Hmm.
And I started to use that intentionally as a tool. So
Hmm.
I think we tend to think of our attention as like out of our control.
Right.
Um, and in many ways, it's kind of, that might be the case, because there's almost $1 trillion a year spent on marketing and advertising to hijack our attention. And so
Yeah.
it really,
Yeah.
but I'll give you an example. Like I could take like a pencil that I have here, like, with me. And, normally I would just pick it up to write and put it back down. But if I'm going to pinch my brain, I might just for a moment, like, look at the textures on it and the writing. And I'm just sort of like examining it. And what's interesting is like in that moment, I'm squeezing the other thoughts out of my mind. I'm actually
Hmm.
focusing on something. And what I found
Hmm.
is that the more things I can, like the more times I can do that in my day and be consistent about focusing my attention on what's around me and being curious about textures and shapes and colors,
Hmm.
it actually refines my ability to focus. So I'm able to read for longer periods of time. I'm able to, like, it creates a domino effect. It's a multiplier effect. I'm able to apply it in other areas
Hmm.
of my
Hmm.
life. It
Hmm.
gives me the confidence that I can focus.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that's another tool
Hmm.
that I've been using, which has been, super critical throughout my life.
Sounds like a pretty high overlap with kind of mindfulness philosophy. Maybe I mean, we don't have to get a long discussion about that, but a lot of what you're saying sounds pretty. There's a high overlap. Is that the case, or you think it's different?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. And to me, one of the challenges that I've had in my life is, I feel like there's a lot of discussion around how important mindfulness is. I've always been challenged with, I get it's important, but what's the process that works for me that I can actually get there or get on a path to get there?
Hmm.
And I feel like that can, in many ways, it can't really just be served by other people. Like, here's the way to do it, and then you try and it doesn't work for you, and like, okay, so it doesn't work. For me, what I found is like my life has just been so experimental. I've been tinkering with things, since I was a very, very young. Actually, between the second and third grade, I had this like transformational experience with a tutor that sort of awakened my mind, this mindfulness. And I realized that anytime I can't do something or think something doesn't work, or I'm not great at something, I quickly realize I switch my mind to, it's because I haven't engaged a process that works for me. And so
Hmm.
to me, that's been the challenge with mindfulness, is that you hear like that's such a great thing, and meditate and this and that. But what I found is I needed to experiment with all kinds of different things to find what works for me. And what works for me in this moment may not work for me a month from now or a year
Hmm.
from now.
Hmm.
And so I constantly need to be kind of tinkering in my life. And so I've developed this, almost like this algorithm or this strategy where I'm constantly trying to engage in practices and rituals and learn about what other people are doing. And then I'll give it a go and see, hey, how does that work for me? How does it feel? How does it sort of translate in my life into impact or value or something important that I'm trying to do?
Hmm.
And so through that process, I find it's a very exhilarating process to do that. So
Hmm.
that's kind of my sort of take on mindfulness, is that it's really, yes, there is overlap with what I'm describing, but it's more about finding a process that works for you. And that's what lit is about. It's like all these on ramps for people to experiment with, to try to focus your attention, how to be more grateful and live with gratitude, how to connect more deeply with people, how to deepen our everyday experiences, how do we resensitize our aliveness and our senses. Like, we need multiple on ramps to
Hmm.
figure out what's going to work for us.
So as it turns out, has the book mostly been more useful for people with ADHD, or has it really been more broad? What has the reception been about these tools that in your book?
Yeah, it's been pretty broad, I would say. Definitely people with ADHD, there's been a lot of resonance there. I gave a book, I spoke at the book, did like a launch in Canada at the University of Toronto. And there were a number of children actually with ADHD who came out to hear me speak. And then, they went up to the microphone at the end and asked me questions about, hey, I'm struggling with this and that. And, what are your suggestions? Which was really an incredible moment, to connect in that way. And there's been other sort of launch events and things that I've done where it seems as though a lot of people are struggling today with attention issues, even if it's not ADHD. I think that are sort of, we're overstimulated in this digital world, and this sort of on-demand lifestyle, and this sort of departure from our connection to nature. I think it's creating and sort of rewiring our brains so that it makes it harder to focus.
Mm.
And I think so the attention aspects of lit and the strategies I think are really resonating with people. But so are strategies like one of the tools I use all the time, I call press pause. And it's really so I'll give you an example. I there were periods of my life where I was just back to back meetings, and I get to the end of the day and I'd literally, be like midnight, 1 a.m., 1:30 a.m., whatever. And I feel like, wow, I just did like 2 marathons of work today. And then
Mm.
I just repeat it the next day and the next day and the next day. And what I realized though, as I'm kind of experimenting with all of these tools, I realized that when I put a break or a pause in between my meeting, so I take like 5 or 10 minutes just to do nothing, no email, go for a walk, or just close my eyes, all of a sudden I realize I'm starting to make connections I wasn't making before. Like somebody would have said something to me the week before, month before, and the person who I just met with said something, and I'm like, wait a moment, I should get us all together,
Mm.
like there's something here. And I would miss that if I just did the back to back to back meeting. So it's like I realize our brains need time to sync up, to
Mm.
process information and experiences.
Mm. Mm.
And by the way, that's one of the reasons why when I go to the bathroom now, I don't bring my phone with me, because I feel like that's like a powerful moment as well, just to like reflect. And there's been so many times in those moments, like even when I'm like having a meal or when I'm walking the dogs outside, where I come up with these ideas, or I make these connections
Mm.
when I'm not on my phone. And so it's happened so many times that now I just have confidence that if I don't, like, I'm not going to use my phone now, because I don't know what's going to come to me in this
Yeah,
moment. And
yeah.
I know so many times like amazing things have come into my mind. And so
Mm.
so that's where the press pause, I think, is
Mm.
so
Mm.
powerful in our lives.
Mm. It's what we used to talk about, like going to the shower. That's probably the one of the few times now where people don't have their phones.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I used to, I mean, I'll totally admit it, be transparent about it. Like I used to do conference calls in the shower.
Wow.
So yeah, trying to
Amazing.
multitask, just trying to get as much as I possibly could done in my day. And I think that's one of the challenges of sort of modern living, is that it's like you don't know how fast you're going until you pause and think about it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, if you're on an airplane or in a car, it's sort of like you don't really realize, you feel like you don't feel like you're going faster in the plane than the car, right? But it's like when you get out and sort of look at it and see how fast it's going, you're like, wow. And I feel like that we're challenged by that in today's society, because things seem to be not just going fast but accelerating. And
Yeah.
I think sort of like, our interaction with artificial intelligence and like chat gpt and Gemini and all these platforms are incredible, and there's like amazing uses for them, and I use them all the time. But I'm also recognizing how they're accelerating my life, they're accelerating my thinking. And I think that it's like now more than ever we actually need to pause, because there's so much information happens, like streaming at us. We need time to let our brains sync up for our subconscious and conscious,
Yeah.
parts of
Yeah.
our mind to sort of get into balance.
Well, tell me a little bit about the interaction, the synergies with, this book you wrote, which is kind of about how you develop these personal tools with your kind of your research that you're doing, the research that's ongoing that you talked about at the beginning about how to use nature to solve, medical and other health issues. Are they different? Is there this interesting relationship, and how are you allocating your time between these two things?
Yeah, so we use the tools in lit every day in the lab. One of the ways we use it, so one of the things that actually happened to me in between the second and the third grade is that so the second grade teacher actually wanted to hold me back and repeat the second grade. And because I just was not getting anything, I felt like an alien, very discouraged, and just things weren't going well. But my parents negotiated for me to spend the summer with tutors. And when I went in one day and the tutor read a passage, I gave some answers to questions, and then she looked me in the eye and said, "How did you think about that?"
Mm-hmm.
And no one had ever asked me that question. It put me into like this self-reflection mode. And it's like it was like a light bulb moment to me, because all of a sudden it was like, oh, I can think about thinking. And that's where mindfulness awareness actually began in my life. And one of the key things that I discovered through this newfound awareness was anytime I asked a question, I could hyper focus on the answer for a few moments, whatever the answer was, and I could connect it to other things in my mind. I could recall it later. Like there was like this energy around asking a question. And I realized that questions were I needed for survival, essentially, to learn, because in class, in college, I there's a number of classes I couldn't ask questions. I just stopped going because I was too frustrated. I was actually angry, right? There was a lot of anger sitting in a class and not being able to process what's happening. And so in my laboratory, questions have become just the cornerstone of what we do, because what I realize is that through my life experiences is that questions, that the process of inquiry, it's a skill. It's a skill we can get better at over time. And there's no end. It's like limitless. And as I look around in the scientific community, in academia, I realize that the people who are doing the most impactful work are the ones not using the most sophisticated technology and tools. It's the people who are asking the highest value questions. And so in my laboratory, I've been working really hard to figure out, okay, how can we develop a process because it's not just about asking like low value questions and high value questions. It's about, in some ways, asking questions, listening, iterating to figure out what the high value questions are. So I rarely will ever start with a high value question, but over time I can get to them through this process. And so one of the questions I ask in every lab meeting is the following, which is, what's the bar that we need to exceed to get everybody excited? So it's like the so what question. Like, how much better do we need to do than the best result anyone has achieved? And there's no direct answer, but because there's like, nuances and things. But by thinking about that and making that the North Star of every project, it's allowed us to keep on track towards achieving impact. So it's sort of like, in a particular, like one example will be like, let's say we do work in cancer research. I mean, we do work in all kinds of, we develop tissue glues that can seal holes inside a beating heart. We've developed therapies for arthritis and cancer and all kinds of different things. But let's say we're working on cancer. We might say, okay, in this particular model, what's the best result anyone has achieved? So it'd be like a certain number of animals, survive, a certain percent survive for a certain period of time. And then we might say, okay, can we do 20% better, 50% better? Like what's our goal? And then we set that as the goal. And then all the experiments that we are conducting, we have that goal in mind. And I feel like in academia, it's kind of weird. Like, that's not the go-to strategy. Often you end up doing incremental work if you don't have that North Star that you're constantly coming back to. So I kind of felt that gravity in the lab of like gravitating towards incremental work is just easy to just to push things a little further, but the chance of it ever helping anyone is very small. And so I found through striving to ask high value questions has helped. Actually, almost every major project in the laboratory has translated into a company. So I've co-founded 13 companies.
Wow.
And number of products on the market, number of technologies going through clinical trials. And I really think one of the key aspects of that is our commitment to figuring out the high value questions to ask.
So give me some examples of what you talked about earlier, problems that you've encountered and then where you found the solution in nature to help solve those problems.
Absolutely. So back in around 2009, 2010, Dr. Pedro Del Nido, who's chief of cardiac surgery at Boston Children's Hospital, reached out with a problem that he was experiencing in his treatment of very young children who have heart defects.
Mm-hmm.
So 1 in 200 to 300 children have a congenital heart defect. They're born with a heart defect, and a percentage of them require surgery. A number of them will have actually a hole in between the chambers of the heart. It's called the septal defect.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Del Nido described how sometimes he would go to suture it and the tissue would just tear because it's so fragile. These are such young kids, babies. And he said there's devices that work in adults, but you can't simply downsize them because they're permanent materials. And as the heart grows, it'll outgrow the device. And then so you have to come back and do multiple revision procedures as the heart is growing. So we brainstormed with him and came up with an idea that we would develop it was kind of a pie in the sky idea, but you got to start somewhere. It was a patch that you'd put into the heart. It would attach to the tissue around the hole and immediately seal that hole. And then cells would migrate on top of it, form new tissue, the material would degrade, and the patient would be left with their own tissue sealing the hole, which could then naturally grow with the patient. And so, we started to kind of put together some ideas and thoughts and a plan. And it's probably the most challenging experiment we've ever done in the lab or project we've worked on, because the heart is beating on average 60 times a minute, often faster in children too. You have the rush of, so you have expansion contraction cycle. So if you're trying to attach something, it can delaminate, it can fall off. The rush of blood, it's like filled with cells and enzymes, and it's like, every surface is covered with blood. And so we approached it and we encountered failure after failure, like nothing was working. And when you hear like blood, sweat, and tears, it literally was all three of those. And so what we did is at one point we said, okay, we're going to step back and how can we approach this in a new way? Because I think there's a tendency in sort of human thinking that you approach something, it doesn't work, you step back, you think you're thinking differently about it, but you're actually applying the same thinking and expecting different outcomes. And I think that's what a big part of what LIT is about, is intercepting patterns. And so I recognized there was a pattern of thinking we needed to intercept. And so we said, okay, well, what creatures exist within wet dynamic environments in nature? How do they work? How do creatures stick onto surfaces as water's like, kind of sloshing around or dynamically moving? And we looked far and wide, and some of the creatures we looked at were like sandcastle worms. So they sit on rocks in the ocean, the waves are hitting them and they remain put. And then sometimes you'll see like a slug or a snail sitting on a leaf, it's raining and it's not falling off, it's somehow just stuck on. And so we realized that a number of creatures have these viscous secretions, things like viscous like honey, for example. And these secretions have hydrophobic agents in them that repel water. And so we started thinking, wait a moment, what if we made our glue have similar process to these secretions that we see in nature? So what if we made it more viscous? What if we made it more hydrophobic? And so what happened was, through learning about some of these examples in nature as part of the solutions that exist from evolution, we brought them back into the lab. We created a patch with a layer of glue that was viscous and that was hydrophobic. And so we put it actually inside a beating heart of a pig. We showed we could repel the blood away from the surface of the heart. We were able to get the glue to infiltrate into the tissue, and then we made it light activatable. So we shine light on it. The light cures the glue, and it's almost like this like tissue like Velcro. It like cures inside the tissue.
Wow.
And so we were able to create this solution, and we received regulatory approval in Europe for vascular reconstruction for just the glue, not the whole patch thing. And now that material, the glue, is in 2 clinical trials right now, one for hernia repair, so doing hernia repair without tacks, because the tacks can cause a lot of pain, they can move around and cause a lot of problems, and then also for nerve reconstruction. We're in a clinical trial. So we're right now, if someone has like a nerve injury in their hand or their finger, for example, what happens is you get this tube, and the nerve is stuffed into the ends of the tube, and then it's sutured to the tube so it can stay in place. You're actually putting a needle through the nerve, which can cause a lot of damage and reduce the chance of gaining, recovering. And so we found a way to make this tube out of the same glue material and then glue the nerve to the tube so we don't have to damage the nerve. So that's in a clinical trial as well.
Wow, sounds so amazing. How many of these projects do you have ongoing at any given time, like say right now?
It varies, but often it's somewhere on the order of maybe like 15, sometimes it gets
Oh.
up to 20, 25. It's kind of, it varies. One of the projects that we've been working on for the past few years is to create these robotic pills. And one of the challenges is like, if you take a pill, for example, often the idea is that you want whatever's in that pill, the drug, to go into the bloodstream, but there's all these barriers that it has to get through, and the absorption through the intestine into the bloodstream is often a major barrier. So some drugs, less than 1% of what you have in the pill actually gets into the bloodstream. And so we've been creating these simplified robotic pills that can actually inject, like you take the pill, and then this like robot that we developed, very simplified, scalable system, can then inject into the tissue of the intestine, and we can get very high amounts of the drug into blood, which is very important with biologics or proteins, peptides, some of the new types of drugs that are coming online.
Well, it's so interesting because I mean, it seems like you really have taken your ADHD and turned it into a superpower because you found a profession. I mean, for somebody who likes to change and look at different things, I mean, my goodness, what could be better than working on 15 or 20 totally different projects every day? And I mean, my goodness, that
Right.
must just be, I mean, that just must be amazing. I mean, most people focus on one thing. We think about most researchers, they do one project for years and decades, and you get to work on 20 things at the same time.
Yeah, no, it's definitely definitely exhilarating. And I think there's a number of things that also I've realized have to happen in order for this to work. One is I have needed to really live my life with a significant amount of vulnerability, because I'm so curious about, getting into new areas and thinking like an engineer. Often, like engineers, kind of classically, the idea is that, you know the engineering kind of problem solving approaches, you only need to know like 0.1% or 1% of all the knowledge. You need to have like the team has to have the knowledge, but the person who's like, kind of putting it together needs to figure out what's the most important information and like be a detective. And I love doing that. But at the same time, I need to ask a lot of basic fundamental questions, that people who are deep in the field, it's like obvious to them. And so as I'm getting into new areas, I have to really live this visceral vulnerability, because I'm asking like the 101 questions so that I can learn what I need to learn to, be, kind of help guide the projects and maximize rigor and maximize like the impact. But that to me is also really exciting, because I've created this environment in my lab is very lateral. And so, this is part of the tool of humility, like be human, be humble. And so I'm learning from everybody in the lab, and everyone's learning from me, everyone's learning from each other. And so to me, that it's just so incredible. Like my lab has, I've constructed it so it's like minimal overlap of expertise in the lab. A lot of labs have, it's like the lab is filled with people with the same expertise. My lab is minimal overlap. And so the idea is that it's like maximizing turning diversity into a superpower, really, because we've had people from over 30 countries in the lab. People are subjected to different education systems. They think differently. They process information differently. We've had engineers like mechanical engineers, chemical engineers, electrical engineers, immunologists, biologists. We've had a gastrointestinal surgeon, a cardiac surgeon, a dentist, constantly changing. And so now it's this environment where everyone can learn from each other. And our reach is phenomenal because we can reach into all these different areas. We have access to all these different tools and strategies, ways of thinking, and experimental processes, and so it's just so incredible because any project we work on, it's like there's so many people in the lab who can contribute. No one else can provide that same expertise, so people feel validated. They're more likely to go all in.
That's amazing. Will you ever write that original book that the agent came and talked to you about?
Definitely I've thought about it. And you never know. Yeah, maybe someday we'll come back to writing a book about bioinspiration.
Well, Jeff, this has been a fascinating conversation. I can't believe the things you're working on. We could have talked hours for it. I know you're super busy, so I really appreciate your taking the time, but thanks for sharing this insight with me.
Hey, thank you so much for the great conversation.
This is Richard Chu and Jeff Karp.